The Ukrainian Defense Forces struck the 100th arsenal of the main missile and artillery directorate of the Russian Ministry of Defense in the Kostroma region. There are warehouses there for the long-term storage of ammunition for the ground forces. Ukrainian drones also struck the Herakon Plus oil depot near the village of Streletsky Hutura in the Lipets region. In addition, enemy drone control points were hit in the Donetsk, Kursk, and Belgorod regions. In all cases, hits on the targets were confirmed, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russian military leadership has set a new goal for its troops, to retake Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region. Now, the deadline is set for February of this year. The enemy army is trying to break into the city, but without success. Also, according to various estimates, there are currently between 60 and 100 Russian soldiers in Kupiansk itself, hiding in the basements of apartment buildings, completely surrounded.
Putin has backed himself into a pretty idiotic situation. Well, look, he basically declared to the whole world 3 times publicly that the Russian army had full total control over Kupiansk. Then, let's say they tried to cover for him. Russian Z-bloggers and propagandists tried to make excuses saying it wasn't about total control, just partial control. Then they claimed that the Ukrainian army carried out large-scale counteroffensive operations with heavy casualties and basically pushed the Russian army out of Kupiansk. But we all know perfectly well that there was no large-scale assault or counteroffensive by the Ukrainian army in this context. We systematically and methodically pushed the Russians out of Kupiansk, primarily by blocking their logistics. At the
same time, in the Konstantinovka direction, Ukrainian soldiers stopped Russian assaults in the areas of the settlements of Oleksandr Shultine, Plashtivka, and towards Stepanivka and Sofiivka. Near Pokrovsk, fighting took place around Nikonarivka, Rodinske, Mirnograd, Kotlin, Filia, and Grishine. In the Huliaipole direction, which is the most intense, the defense forces have now thwarted the occupiers' attempts to advance toward Dobropilia, Vavarivka, Zeleny, and Perlugi.
Lately, the enemy has somewhat cooled their fervor. There have been fewer attacks on various sections of the front. Except for those sections of the front that are a priority for the enemy. Fighting continues in the area of Myronograd, in the Pokrovsk area, and accordingly in the Chatsev Yar area and in the Lyman direction. There, the intensity is not decreasing at all. And this is the value the enemy places on conducting combat operations. But on other sections of the front, to a certain extent, we can talk about stagnation.
Ukraine's defense forces thwarted a Russian assault using ATVs in the direction of Huliaipole, Donetsk region. The enemy tried to take advantage of heavy snowfall, gale force winds, and almost zero visibility to secretly move in an assault group. Because of the bad weather, aerial reconnaissance was difficult, and the Russian troops were counting on moving through unnoticed. However, pilots from the Signum Battalion still spotted the invaders' advance, and thanks to coordinated action, eliminated enemy personnel and destroyed Russian equipment. Meanwhile, in the Zaporizhia direction, Ukrainian drone system operators eliminated Russian soldiers who were preparing for an assault using buggies and ATVs. As Ukrainian soldiers note, the enemy uses light vehicles to quickly advance toward the positions of the defense forces. Thanks to the coordinated work of reconnaissance and strike drones, Russian mobile groups were destroyed even as they approached, thwarting yet another attack attempt.
Given the trends of the last 3 months, I'm talking about October, November, and December, the number of Russian servicemen killed each day exceeds the number of those wounded. In other words, the medical evacuation system is working very poorly, and the protective forces and means for ensuring the resilience of those very Russian assault troops is practically not being implemented. Well, obviously, there's very little armored equipment on the battlefield, and moving across that same battlefield in adopted vehicles leads to a rather significant number of fatalities among the Russian assault troops.
And over the past 24 hours, Ukraine's defense forces have eliminated another 940 Russian occupiers. Thus, the total losses of the Russian army since the start of the full-scale invasion have exceeded 1,213,000 personnel. In addition, Ukrainian defenders destroyed 5 tanks, 6 armored fighting vehicles, 46 artillery pieces, 1 multiple rocket launcher, and 1 air defense system yesterday. They also disabled 157 units of Russian automotive equipment.
Our broadcast is joined by Alexander Musienko, a serviceman of the Territorial Defense Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine and a military analyst. Alexander, welcome. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes, huh?
Alexander Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief, is now emphasizing the importance of unmanned systems forces, citing quite telling numbers regarding both enemy soldiers and equipment destroyed. I've probably been asking this question to our military experts for the past 2 years. Is artillery still the god of war these days, or has something changed in that regard?
I would say that, without a doubt, war is transforming. We can see this from Ukraine's experience in particular. Moreover, I can point out and emphasize that the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Syrskyi, specifically noted and highlighted the fact that Russia, following Ukraine's example, is creating its own drone forces, which they plan to staff with about 80,000 servicemen. Why did this happen? Well, our enemy saw that it works, and they want to adopt Ukrainian tactics. For Ukraine, in this case, the key priority is always to stay ahead. That means we have to be more effective, we have to be more creative, and we have to scale up our solutions. Overall, I can say that by 2026, the advantage will lie in the transformation of drones. There will be a greater number of reconnaissance drones, which will have better optics, will be improved, will be more effective in difficult weather conditions, and will be able to detect enemy infantry groups and effectively destroy them, with the help of drones and with the help of artillery, which I will also talk about now. That's why the drone war continues. On the battlefield, it's all about scaling up and being effective. On the battlefield, we are confronted with tactics used by our enemies against us when they deploy a large number of small infantry groups. If before it used to be 2-to-1 squads, meaning 10 to 12 people, then it became 5 to 7. Now it's 3 to 5, sometimes just 3 people who need to be identified, detected, neutralized, and eliminated on the battlefield. Our units are directly coordinated to deal with this. And indeed, there is quite a significant result, as reported by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. In addition to drones, I would include not only unmanned aerial vehicles, but also ground-based robotic systems, since they also have a pretty serious impact. This is the future. We see that they are being used effectively on the battlefield, including by force units. The Territorial Defense Forces, which right now the 3rd Army Corps is using them, and they have demonstrated quite high effectiveness in employing ground-based robotic systems to reinforce infantry, provide fire support, deliver essential supplies, transport and evacuate the wounded, and so on. There is also serious potential in this area, and as for artillery as well. In many ways, it can't operate without drones, without fire correction, without target identification, without the guidance provided by reconnaissance drones. And here, close cooperation is crucial. Artillery, despite the development of unmanned systems, still carries significant weight, because when we talk about Russian forces, from time to time, they still try to break through with assault groups. These are part of mechanized platoons, where armored vehicles and tanks are used. Still, as a means of destruction, artillery plays a significant role, specifically against enemy combat vehicles. And of course, a shell strike is more effective in terms of the warhead and so on. That's why artillery has played and will continue to play its role. But of course, when working together with drones, its effectiveness only increases.
The other day, we spoke with the commander of the Achilles Regiment, Yuri Fedorenko. He said that now the so-called kill zone, which the Russian occupiers are trying to overcome, has expanded from 20, in some places even up to 40 kilometers. But nevertheless, we almost. Every week we hear several times about these desperate assaults, these desperate attempts to get through this kill zone. This is happening near Pokrovsk and also in the Lyman direction. Why is this happening? Why is it, maybe, that Russian commanders are rushing their soldiers somewhere? Why is it that this infiltration tactic, on the one hand, is being carried out, but at certain stages, well, maybe patience runs out, and so they go on these pointless assaults, when even the motorcyclists are destroyed before they even start to cross that kill zone? What do you think is the reason for the increase in this, I would say, semi-mechanized tactic, specifically trying to cross the kill zone using fast vehicles like buggies, ATVs, and motorcycles.
First of all, it's obvious that if you're trying to get through on motorcycles or other mechanized vehicles, let's include buggies and so on. First, it's easier to do this off-road with those vehicles, which is why the enemy uses this tactic. Second, they try to do this with small groups. And third, they're basically counting on the fact that this way they'll be able to break through under certain conditions in small groups, using the same infiltration tactics. The thing is, first of all, the enemy takes advantage of the weather conditions. When we have thick fog, and in winter it's not always possible to recognize or identify targets due to the weather, they try to ramp up the number of their assault actions, especially when the weather gets worse. They're basically trying to avoid being detected by drones. Plus, what they're trying to do is use ever greater numbers. That is, they constantly spread out their assault groups in different directions and try to sneak through, basically to get through that very same kill zone. In many ways, of course, it's a one-way road. Very often, that's exactly how it ends for Russian troops. That's exactly why their losses have increased so much. The number of assault operations by the Russian armed forces has increased, but the losses have also increased. In fact, right now, literally at the end of last year and now, we've reached a point where, for perhaps the first time during the full-scale invasion, Russian troops don't have the potential and aren't building up their troop grouping. The numbers remain relatively stable. They're only able to replenish their losses. So that's the first point of the task. We've accomplished it. We haven't allowed the enemy to build up their troop grouping. There are already problems with their personnel, and that's now clear. Now, the second task. It's also quite difficult and ambitious, but its implementation is ongoing. To inflict such losses that the enemy won't be able to, and will already start to feel serious problems in recruiting actual military personnel to make up for their losses. Work on this is also ongoing. So, in order to generally restrict the battlefield and to make the kill zone work practically at 100%, or at least 99.9%, we're working on introducing new technological solutions and increasing the effectiveness of our drones. This is what I was talking about in the first question, when I said that we want to develop our advantages so we can see even farther, identify targets, and accordingly strike them. There will only be more of these drones, so that we can reach the point where we control the battlefield, including with the help of ground-based robotic systems. Well, as for the Russian troops, we understand that the orders are given in the headquarters. And, it's become a meme by now, maybe even a joke. How many times has Putin already captured Kupiansk and so on? After all, they have to report some kind of victories in the end, whether they're so-called victories or imaginary ones, in the reports of the Russian command, to their superiors. That's why they try to make up for it in their reports, by claiming captured positions or territories. They try to compensate with the number of firefights, the number of assault operations they launch. So Russian headquarters, by inflating the numbers, try to provide reports that include data on the number of assault operations, which are supposedly equivalent to actual advances on the front, or at least achieving some tactical results. That's basically the reason for it, of course, so that such reports can be made. Well, it's the Russian infantry that has to pay the price, constantly being sent in. These absolutely senseless assaults, which are often a one-way trip.
Let's talk about the hottest spots. And I'd like to point out that since the beginning of this year, Russian forces have noticeably intensified their activity in the Seryabransky forest area in the Luhansk region, according to the 81st Air Mobile Brigade of the Air Assault Forces. The armed forces of Ukraine, the enemy is trying to amass troops and equipment, but Ukrainian units are systematically disrupting their logistics. The situation remains especially tense near the settlement of Dronovka. Russian units are operating in small groups, trying to bypass the village, establish control over it, and then advance toward Platonovka and Zakotne. If these plans were carried out, the enemy would gain the opportunity. They would be able to establish logistical routes along the Seversky Donetsk River, which would create a threat of advancing toward Lyman and Slavyansk. So this area was, well, relatively speaking, compared to Pokrovsk last year, relatively quiet. But now the Russians have stepped up their efforts here. Right here. Let me remind you. This is north of Sloviansk. If you look at the map, there's a sort of bulge with active Russian advances. How critical is this situation here, and what are the defense forces doing to neutralize this offensive?
First of all, it should be noted that the entire Donetsk region is one of the enemy's priority directions for offensive operations. And basically, I can say that let's put it this way, there are no relatively calm areas, since assault operations are taking place along the entire front line in Donetsk region. Yes, indeed, we can note that there are more of them in the Pokrovsk direction, if we're talking about the number of assault actions specifically. But overall, the entire Donetsk region is quite a hotspot. The enemy maneuvers its troops from time to time, essentially trying to probe and analyze our defensive line. They try to find weak spots, as it seems, and then break through and continue their assault operations. But we see that even after our troops withdrew to safer positions in the Seversk area, Ukrainian forces are still able to hold the defense, using elevated positions and geographical features to restrain the enemy. The same applies to the Serebryansky forest in the sense that, in fact, Russia is using a significant amount of aviation, airstrikes with guided bombs, in order to achieve a certain effect, trying to destroy our positions and enable further advances. But overall, I can note that for us, the key and most important thing in our strategic defensive operation remains the following. It is to minimize the enemy's rate of advance and inflict as many losses as possible. These goals are being achieved. Even in those places where we have to withdraw, it's actually not very far. In reality, it's to more favorable positions. Basically, the tasks of holding back Russian forces are being carried out and continue moving forward. This is also reflected in the analysis of our international partners, who refer to their own intelligence data. For example, American intelligence, which says that at this pace, even if Russia were successful, it would take them 20 to 30 months to capture the Donetsk region. And that says a lot. It speaks to the resilience of the Ukrainian defense.
Southern Ukraine. Lately, there's been quite a lot of information about Huliaipole. They say that the entire territory of the city is already a gray zone, and the enemy is actively trying to advance. How real is the threat of a serious enemy advance there? Why have the Russians become so active, specifically in the south, particularly in the Zaporizhia region, in this direction?
The thing is, back in 2025, first the Novopavlivka direction, and then, in fact, what we are now seeing in the Huliaipole area were being developed by Russian forces. Offensive actions, unfortunately, had a certain degree of success. And essentially, at the end of 2025 and the beginning of 2026, this direction was chosen. For the adversary, as one of the priorities for conducting offensive operations, as was previously warned by the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, now the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, Kirill Budanov, one of the priorities for Russian forces would be to carry out offensive actions, specifically in the Zaporizhia direction, and that's exactly what we're seeing happening now. And basically after the end of 2025. Russian forces had certain successes, including in the direction of Huliaipole. At present, the situation has been relatively stabilized, blocking further advances, including by units of the territorial defense forces and the armed forces, who are holding the defensive lines quite effectively. And in this sector, other units of the defense and security forces are managing to hold back the enemy's onslaught. In fact, the situation has been stabilized. But we understand that the Pokrovsky direction and the Huliaipole direction, and overall attempts to advance in the Zaporizhia region, will be among the enemy's priorities on the front in the coming weeks and months. That is why corresponding defensive actions are being taken, including the deployment of additional units and reserves, in order to, based on assessing the enemy's actions, let's say, to increase the effectiveness of our defensive line, including in the Zaporizhia direction.
By the way, in the Pokrovsky direction, partisans from Atesh report a sharp drop in morale. Commanders see this as being sent to Pokrovska as a kind of punishment. Well, you think, right? You send the soldiers on a meat grinder assault and just sit it out in your dugout? Why? And even among the officers, there's this kind of demoralization, this defeatist mood, especially in the Pokrovsky direction. So what's really bad for the Russians in terms of getting replacements, both soldiers and officers?
The thing is, the Russian command has some pretty serious, let's say, intentions. And they were already drawing up victories for the fall of 2025. They were already saying that Pokrovsk was practically captured and so on. But they ran into serious resistance from the Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainian troops managed to force the fighting and basically didn't let the enemy encircle them from the flanks. Our positions were maintained, and despite difficult conditions, logistics and the delivery of ammunition were ensured. At this point, we've basically managed to tie up the enemy in combat. Because the Russian command was counting on a pretty swift, rapid offensive operation, but they ran into serious resistance and defensive actions from our troops. And despite the fact that a rather significant grouping of Russian troops is involved, they are taking losses, and for a much longer period than they expected. They've basically gotten themselves into serious combat operations. That's why, as a result, their morale is dropping. After all, the command had promised the lower-ranking officers and regular sergeants something completely different. They themselves have even said this publicly, and even Kremlin representatives have claimed that Pokrovsk has already been practically captured, but that doesn't reflect reality. Plus, they are suffering serious losses. Because of this, of course, it leads to a decline in, let's say, morale and fighting spirit, overall among the Russian troops stationed in this direction.
Today on our broadcast, perhaps the main topic is the results of the coalition meeting that took place in Paris. From your point of view, how significant are the agreements reached by Ukraine, the United Kingdom, France, and other representatives? Europe and NATO countries. Can we say that, in principle, the foundation has been laid for, well, at least the presence of a multinational contingent in Ukraine and security guarantees from Europe? Is this question already settled?
I would say that overall it's quite a positive development that, first of all, the calls of the President of Ukraine, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, were heard, calls he voiced a year ago at the Munich Security Conference. Back then, Volodymyr Zelensky said that it was necessary to unite around Ukraine because the security of not only Ukraine, but all of Europe depends on it. And what happened in Paris? First and foremost, it demonstrates that Europe is ready to unite around Ukraine. Without Ukraine, without a sovereign, independent Ukraine, the architecture of European security, our partners can no longer imagine it. I believe this is one of the most important achievements. The second point is that we have truly moved from talk and statements to real action. That is, now there are already declarations, including when we talk about the multinational military contingent of our partners. This concerns the declaration by Ukraine, France, and Britain, which provides that this could happen. And this is already real progress and a step forward. Next, there is the provision for the deployment of military hubs on the territory of Ukraine. Our partners, for the purpose of guaranteeing security, this is also progress. But in order to fully assess, let's say, everything that has happened in all its details, not in its entirety, I think it's necessary to wait until the negotiations on this topic are finished, because they are still ongoing, continuing in working groups, including with the participation of the Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine and the new head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, Kirilo Budanov, who has really gotten seriously involved in the work. So I think that going forward we will see and learn more information, particularly about such details, quite serious and specific ones, like monitoring and verification. A ceasefire, if it is achieved, is what we are truly striving for. That's why I think progress has been made, but the process is ongoing, and there are still many details left to agree upon. But the main thing, as Mr. Budanov said, I believe, is that Ukraine's national interests will be protected.
Subscribe to UATV English and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.